If you've stepped into a cinema or opened a streaming service in recent years, you probably noticed a certain trend. Wherever you look, much of the content kind of looks the same. Never-ending franchises, milked for every last dollar that can be squeezed out of them. Average superhero movies, and endless prequels, sequels, spin-offs, and reboots of the same things that we have already seen, but somehow worse than the originals. And the statistics confirm this feeling. The movies that are made in Hollywood have radically changed, and probably not for the better. While every now and then, a good and innovative movie is made, compared with the 80s or the 90s, the level of creativity is objectively much lower. And we keep getting more of the same boring and predictable stuff. But how did that happen? Well, it's not a coincidence. There is a reason why studios don't make nearly as many good movies as they used to, and it has to do with how the movie industry makes money. So why is that? How did it happen? And will it ever change? This is why Hollywood doesn't make good movies anymore. If you look at all the classic examples of movies that are not really made anymore, like Forrest Gump, Shawshank Redemption, Good Will Hunting, and thousands of others, they have one thing in common. They are all what's called mid-budget, a category of movies with budgets somewhere between $5 and $75 million. Basically, the middle between the small, cheap, artsy movies and the big-budget blockbusters. But while these movies used to be the bread and butter of Hollywood, today the mid-budget movies are a dying category. In the past 30 years, something has changed, and the movie studios started to make far less mid-budget movies, the category that high-quality films for adults would typically fall into, and instead started to put their money towards making fewer movies with really large budgets. In 1990, the average budget of the highest-grossing films was, adjusted for inflation, $63 million. In 2019, it was $141 million, meaning that 30 years ago, the smaller creative dramas and genre movies were bringing in the most money, while today, that role has been overtaken by the big blockbusters. And it makes sense that if you're going to be putting $200, $300, or even $400 million into producing a single movie, you really want it to succeed, because otherwise, you risk losing a lot of money. And to decrease that risk, it makes sense to invest that kind of funding into something with an already existing franchise, something that people already know and that's already popular, and which, therefore, has a lower risk of failing. And as a result, we are getting the endless reboots, remakes, sequels, and prequels, which are, from the perspective of the studio, safe bets with potentially high return. But the fact that movie studios found out that they can make a crap ton of money on superhero movies and remakes of Lion King is not really the full answer, and it doesn't explain why mid-budget movies are dying out. Movie studios could still be making both bigger and smaller movies, but instead they are more and more giving up on the mid-budget movies entirely. But why is that? Well, the fact is that movie studios, and Hollywood as a whole, have become increasingly risk-averse and unwilling to try anything that doesn't seem like a guaranteed hit. And that's because their business model has radically changed in the past 20 years. In the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, movies would be first released in the cinemas, where they would make a substantial part of the revenue. But then, a couple months later, they would be also released on VHS or DVDs, where they could make almost as much money. In a way, movies were basically released twice, giving them the option to not just make twice as much money, but also the time to build up the marketing and word of mouth. And this was particularly important for the high-quality mid-budget movies, some of which failed to make a splash at first, but then could be discovered later on, like David Fincher's Fight Club, that originally flopped at the box office, but then became a cult classic and made profit once it came out on DVDs. And that way, the risk that the studios were taking was a lot smaller. The problem is that if we compare that to today, and as an example, say that a studio makes a movie with $50 million budget, which is pretty representative of the all-time mid-budget classics. On top of the $50 million it costs to make the movie, the studio also has to pay roughly the same amount on marketing and promotion, and so the real cost of a $50 million movie is really $100 million. But everything that the movie makes is split with the cinemas, in roughly a 50-50 split, meaning that for the studio to get to break even, a movie that costs $50 million to produce has to make at least $200 million before the studio even sees any profit. And that's a massive risk to take, especially at a time when the cinema attendance goes down every year. And of course you might say that instead of DVDs, today you have streaming services. So theoretically, they should make up the missing revenue from DVDs and give the studios the financial safety they need to invest in more creative and therefore risky movies. But while in theory that is correct, in reality this doesn't really happen. Movie studios do make a good amount of money putting their content on streaming services, and today this income is already bigger than from the theaters. But the incentives are different, because streaming services have a subscription model where the user pays for access to everything that's on the platform. The platforms need stuff that everyone will like, or at least as many people as possible. According to Hollywood insiders, this makes the streaming services, like Netflix, even more risk-averse than movie studios, and it means that what they want are broadly appealing, low-risk movies. And what fits that category the most? Well, you guessed it. Remakes, reboots, sequels, prequels, and franchises. And because the already risk-averse studios are now dependent on even more risk-averse streaming services, the whole movie industry is locked in a spiral of creating ever more bland and interchangeable movies that seem like a safe bet in an effort to appeal to as large audiences as possible. So the real question that it comes down to is, can this ever change? And the answer is, perhaps surprisingly, yes, almost certainly it will. Economy and trends both follow cycles, and the one that we are in is bound to change as well. While at the moment, the studios are producing ever more average content to appeal to the average viewer, the audiences will eventually get tired of getting the same low-risk stuff from movie studios again and again, and the revenue will drop. And that's when the studios will be forced to start coming up with new ideas and take risks once again. And this has happened in the movie industry many times before. A trend that makes money appears, everyone jumps on it, and eventually people get bored. It dies down, and studios have to come up with something new. This is basically what happened with Western movies that used to be extremely popular in the 1950s and 1960s. And they were basically the superhero movies of the time. But while the movie studios were ready to milk this genre until the end of times, eventually the audiences got bored. The trends have shifted and Western movies basically disappeared. And chances are that right now we are slowly starting to get to this point as well. Both the latest phase of the MCU movies and the latest productions in the Star Wars universe have not financially performed nearly as well as they used to. And it seems that audiences are starting to get tired. And while we're not there yet, it's economically inevitable that this cycle of recycling cinema will end, and a new golden era of creativity will begin. We just have to wait a little bit longer.